Machine travelers, Miss C here, and today I have a special treat for you. We have Lady Guinevere all the way from England in our time machine. She will be telling you a little bit about the Black Death using some primary documents from her very own scribes. So check out in the comments below, that's where your activity is, so you can follow along as she tells you all about the Black Death. Lady Guinevere, are you ready? Who goes there? Who goes there? Oh, Miss C! Welcome to my castle. I'm Lady Guinevere. It's so nice to have you here today. This is my pet dragon. His name is Gotham. Say hello, Gotham. That's his way of saying hello. Oh, and meet Harvey. He's my knight in shining armor. So Miss Z tells me that you'd like to hear about the Black Death. Oh, it was very dreadful here in England, as well as the rest of Europe. Let me tell you a little bit about life before the plague here in Europe. Before the plague, the feudalism system rigidly divided us. Feudalism is somewhat like the caste system, where you have the king and queen on top, and then the nobles, the knights, and then the serfs and the merchants at the bottom. This seemed to work very well for us, especially those of us at the top. Medical knowledge was mostly based on what the church provided. After all, the Catholic Church was the authority on these matters. Women were largely regarded as second-class citizens, unless you were a noble like myself. But even noble women still didn't have a lot of power within their grasp. Art and architecture mostly represented a benevolent god, and of course at the time there wasn't a very extensive knowledge of germs as you have today. And so when the plague started, we didn't really know where it was coming from. Later, of course, once it was studied, it was found that it was carried by fleas or rats. However, we did not know that at the time. What I'd like to do is share with you some primary documents from the time. These are from our very own scribes. If you'd like to follow along, they are down below. Let me see if I can find the ancient scribe stories. Well, let me look in the scrolls. Here I have my basket of scrolls that the scribes so nicely laid out for us. The first one is from Gabriel del Musi, and I'll just be reading it from the scroll here. He is from Piacenza, and he gives a vivid account of how the plague was in Coffa in Sicily. A little further from me, but still very similar to what we experienced. He says, "Tell, O Sicily, and ye, the many islands of the sea, the judgments of God. Confess, O Genoa, what thou hast done, since we of Genoa and Venice are compelled to make God's chastisement manifest. Alas, our ships enter the port, but 1,000 sailors, hardly 10 are spared. We reach our homes, our kindred, and our neighbors come from all parts to visit us. Woe to us, for we cast at them the darts of death. Whilst we spoke to them, whilst they embraced us and kissed us, we scattered the poison from our lips. Going back to our homes, they in turn soon infected their whole families, who in 3 days succumbed, that means that they gave in to the death, and were buried in one common grave." You see, there were so many that died during this time, we had no time to make separate graves for them. It's very sad. Where was I? Priests and doctors visiting the sick returned from their duties ill, and soon were among the number dead. O death, cruel, bitter, impious death, which thus breaks the bonds of affection and divides father and mother, brother and sister, son and wife, lamenting our misery, we feared to fly, yet we dared not remain. What do we need to know about this? Well, according to the author, he is saying that this was the chastisement of God. If you look at the very beginning, he says, "The judgments of God. Confess, O Genoa, what thou hast done, since we of Genoa and Venice are compelled to make God's chastisement manifest." What that means is that he thought the plague was the judgment of God and his chastisement or punishment for sins of the world at the time. And this was a general belief throughout Europe, that this was a chastisement or judgment of God. Now, what is the point of view of the author? Well, if you look, It says that Gabriel del Musi's account continues to record the terror of Piacenza. Until quite recently, it had been believed that de Musi was himself a passenger on one of the plague ships of Kaffa, but it is fairly certain, that he was in fact in Piacenza during that time, so he probably just saw the ships coming in and knew that there weren't very many that were surviving. I think he said of the sailors there were barely 10 who would survive on each ship. That's not very many. And so because we know that he's seeing this first person, it's definitely a first person point of view, but why do you think he believes that it is God's chastisement? It has to do with his religion. So if you were to write point of view of this person, you would say de Musi's point of view is from a religious standpoint. At the time, there were very many Catholic believers, and they would have thought that this was God's chastisement because they didn't have information concerning science. So for his point of view, it is from a religious point of view. Yes, isn't that right, Gotham? How does he describe the plague? Well, he describes it in very many ways. First of all, he says that it divides the bonds of affection between families. Whole families would die, but sometimes there would be one or two left. And he says it's misery. It's they embraced and they kiss and they scatter the poison from their lips. So almost he knows that they're spreading it between themselves. And then it's very sad, of course, that they couldn't even have separate graves. It's one common grave. That's how many were dying at the time. The next document we have is from Jean de Vignette of the Progress of the Black Death. It says this plague, it is said, began among the unbelievers and came to Italy and then crossing the Alps reached Avignon, where it attacked several cardinals and took from there their whole household. Cardinals would be religious leaders. And then it spread unforeseen to France, through Gascony and Spain, little by little, from town to town, from village to village, from house to house, and finally, from person to person. It even crossed over to Germany, though it was not so bad there as with us. During the epidemic, God, of his accustomed goodness, deigned to grant his grace. But however, suddenly men died. Almost all awaited death joyfully, nor was there anyone who died without confessing his sin and receiving the holy viaticum. So why do you think the author writes that men awaited death joyfully? Well, let me tell you why he writes that. The Black Death was a miserable way to die. You had bulbuls all over you, and you basically drowned to death because you couldn't breathe eventually. Another document will talk about the misery of the Black Death later, but it was just an awful, awful, horrible way to die. The other problem is, as soon as you would get it, your family knew they needed to stay away, and sometimes you had to die alone, which is also miserable. And so that is why the author says that they awaited death joyfully. It was almost as if they wanted to die because it was so horrible and painful. And going on, we are going to talk about who was blamed. It said some said that this pestilence or sickness was caused by infection of the airs and water. Since there was at this time no famine nor lack of food supplies, but on the contrary great abundance. As a result of this theory of infected water and air as the source of the plague, the Jews were suddenly and violently charged with affecting the wells and the water and corrupting the air. The whole world rose up against them cruelly on this account. In Germany and other parts of the world where Jews lived, they were massacred and slaughtered by Christians, and many thousands were burned everywhere indiscriminately. The unshaken, infatuous constantly of the men, their wives, was remarkable. For mothers hurled their children first into the fire, that they might not be baptized, and then leaped in after them to burn with their husbands and children. The Jews are blamed for poisoning the wells and perhaps being the cause of the plague. But why are the Jews blamed? Well, at the time, and all throughout history, Jews are blamed for killing Jesus. And it was already said that the plague was a punishment from God. So many believed that because they were being tolerant of Jews living in Europe, because remember, the Jews are on a diaspora, or spreading out from their homeland. And because they were all over the world at the time, it was believed that maybe Christians were being too tolerant on them, and therefore receiving the judgment of God for not judging the Jews because they killed Jesus. These rumors about the Jews was responsible for the massacre of the Jews in Europe at the time. Whole towns were wiped out. It was a horrible thing. Another example is recorded by a rabbi, and it says, this was in southeastern France. It says local authorities and mobs depended on forced confessions as justification for the attacks on the Jewish populations. Typically, Jews were put on the wheel and tortured until they confessed to elaborate plots, often involving rabbis from faraway places instructing them by letter to poison the wells in an effort to decimate Christianity. They were thought to have wanted to destroy Christianity, and they were forced to confess these things. One such confessor said the poison had been formulated from frogs, lizards, spiders, and even Christian hearts. The poison was wrapped in cloth until it was about the size of a large nut and then deposited in the wells or the springs, the confessors declared. Of course, this was not true. The only thing was that they were being forced to confess this. The church and some monarchs tried to intervene on behalf of the besieged Jewish communities. However, they did so for practical reasons. Chief among them was the fear that the widespread mob violence against Jews would lead to contempt for all forms of authority. You see, they were afraid that people would resist them trying to intervene. Pope Clement VI attempted to put a halt to anti-Jewish violence, noting the illogic of the Jews spreading it through the poison of the wells. He says, and it's recorded here by our scribes, throughout many parts of the world, the same plague, by the hidden judgment of God, has inflicted and afflicts the Jews themselves and many other races who have never lived alongside them. So he basically is saying that this cannot be true, because the plague is everywhere, even where the Jews do not live. And even Jews are dying of this. If the Jews had poisoned the wells, then why are they dying as well? That's a good question. It is also said that many bad Christians were found who in like manner put poison into the wells. What? So maybe it was the Christians themselves. But in truth, such poisonings could not have caused such a great plague or infected so many people. There were other causes, for example, the will of God and the corrupt humors and evil inherent in the air and the earth. Perhaps the poisonings, if they actually took place in some localities, reinforced these causes. The plague lasted in France the greater part of 1348 to 1349, and then it went away. Many country villages and houses remained empty and deserted, and many splendid dwellings lay in ruins. Luckily, I was able to continue living in my castle, but there are many that weren't able to do so. Even in Paris, several houses lay empty. Our next document talks about the mortality in Florence, that would be in Italy, where many people died. And it's from a man named Stefani, who was born in Florence in 1336. He wrote his Florentine Chronicle in the late 1370s and early 1380s. He says the symptoms were the following: a bubo in the groin, where the thigh meets the trunk, or a small swelling under the armpit, sudden fever, spitting blood and saliva, and no one who split blood survived it. It was such a frightful thing that when it got into a house, as was said, no one remained. Frightened people abandoned the house and fled to another. Those in towns fled to villages. Physicians could not be found because they were died like the others. And those who could be found wanted vast sums in hand before they entered the house. And when they did enter, they checked the pulse with face turned away. They inspected the urine from a distance and with something odoriferous under their nose. Child abandoned the father, husband the wife, wife the husband, one brother the other, one sister the other. In all the city there was nothing to do but to carry the dead to burial. And those who died had neither confessor nor other sacraments. That means there was no priest that would come to listen to the confession of their sins. And many died with no one looking after them. And many died of hunger, because when someone took to bed sick, another in the house, terrified, said to him, "I'm going for the doctor." Calmly walking out the door, the other left and did not return again. That's exactly how it was. There was no cure. That was another scary thing about this, that they had no cure for this disease. The symptoms were horrible. The abubu is kind of like a blister, and those would happen in the crevices of your body, as well as the spitting up of blood, and that's why they say that many drowned to death because they could not breathe. There were also many impacts of the Black Death. As I told you at the beginning, before the plague, the king was thought to have owned it all, and he gave land to the nobles. The nobles would manage the serfs as they worked the land, and the knights, my trusty knight back here, were for protection. Before the Black Death, Europe was overpopulated. There were more than enough workers. Serfdom was somewhat like slavery. They were given a place to live and food to eat, but nothing more. There was no upward mobility in this system, as you were born into your role. Serfs were tied to the land generation to generation. But it's recorded here that 25 million people in Europe died from the plague. That's a rough estimate, of course. And that there was a disappearance of around 1,000 villages because so many had died. So, after the Black Death, the workers could demand a higher wage. That was one impact upon Europe due to the Black Death. However, there are more. After the plague, doctors seemed to question and start to think a little bit more scientifically. Medicine began to evolve. The rise of surgeries and studies based on the body began. And another change happened. Before the plague, most everything was written in Latin, mostly by scribes and medical theoreticians. However, because so many of them died in the plague, now things will start to be written in the vernacular language, which means the local language that's spoken in the area. Mostly English if you're speaking about where I live, but could be German, could be French, and that opens the medical field up to many more people, because at the time most people did not speak Latin and they were just taking the word of someone who did. So now common people could read medical texts and start to get some medical knowledge that they couldn't get before. Also, hospitals start to develop. Before the plague, they were only used to isolate sick people, and afterwards they become more of a treatment center for those who are sick. Women also start to gain more rights after the plague. As I told you, before the plague, women didn't have a lot of rights nor respect from the patriarchal society in which we lived. However, so many men died during the plague that some women had to take on more responsibilities as a result when the plague was over. We were now allowed to run our own land or run a business that we formerly were not allowed to run. We also had greater freedoms in choosing our spouse. Although many of these rights will be questioned later by the church, at least they were given initially, and women were definitely better off than they were before the plague. And that, students, was our experience here in Europe with the plague. So many things changed as a result of this dreadful disease. Thank you so much for joining me today. We're so happy to have you here in the castle, aren't we, Gotham? He very much liked it and enjoyed your company. Please have a fantastic day, and we'll see you next time in the Dark Ages. Bye now. Thank you so much for tuning in to this edition of the Time Machine series. Stick around and check out the bloopers. Let me just look here. My basket of scrolls. Whoop. That's not going to work.